What we are trying to do now is really to apply genetic criticism to the body of Sri Aurobindo's manuscripts. I've given myself a lecture recently in this angle, and we hope this will be the beginning of a new collaboration between these institutions. But let me first of all introduce our speaker today, Richard Hartz, who is a member of the Sri Aurobindo Ashram in Pondicherry and notably a member of the Sri Aurobindo Ashram Archives. He is one of the chief editors of the complete critical edition of the work of Sri Aurobindo, published in no less than 36 volumes. The two last volumes of Apparatus will come out very soon. Richard has been consecrating a long work on Savitri's manuscripts. When I first met with Richard more than 10 years ago now, I was really surprised to discover that without knowing much about genetic criticism, he had applied this kind of approach to study the evolution of the composition of Sri Aurobindo's great epic poem. He has also been writing beside editing the complete works. He has been also publishing books in philosophy, like the Clasp of Civilizations. And I'm very glad today to have organized the meeting between this knowledge of manuscript of Sri Aurobindo's work and manuscripts and Lorenzo Vinciguerra. Lorenzo is a philosopher. Besides being an artist, he has been teaching for several years aesthetics in several French universities before moving back to his country, Italy, where he teaches moral philosophy at the University of Bologna. He is a specialist of Spinoza, and I'm sure this will be somehow the link or the sparkle from where this dialogue will start. So I'm afraid we will have to leave the room at 6, apparently. Hopefully the following reservation will be a bit late, but anyway, I don't want to steal too much of time, and I would ask Richard to take my place here. I will just, let me just open his PowerPoint. Yeah, no, he said rise up the volume. Okay, so now. And it's basically this.
Yeah, okay, fine.
Okay.
It's, wait a minute. Okay.
Shift.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's better. That's much better, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Whenever you
Okay.
like, the floor is yours.
Okay, I've called this presentation The Genesis of a Transcultural Vision in the Manuscripts of Sri Aurobindo. We'll see in a moment why I've called it a transcultural vision, because although Sri Aurobindo is normally categorized as an Indian thinker, it's in fact impossible to fit him neatly into the Indian tradition or any other limiting tradition. The nature of his thought transcends cultural boundaries. Also, by using the word vision rather than philosophy, I want, part of my reason for doing that was to talk about Sri Aurobindo as a poet as well as a philosopher, and we'll see how he envisaged the convergence of poetry and philosophy, which were equally important in his writings. So this is an overview of Sri Aurobindo's life and also of this talk. I'll proceed more or less in chronological order, although at certain points I'll take up a certain theme and forget about the chronological sequence momentarily. But these different periods of Sri Aurobindo's life are quite strikingly different from each other. Quite the demarcations between different periods are quite definite, so much so that my colleague Peter Hees entitled his scholarly biography of Sri Aurobindo "The Lives of Sri Aurobindo," rather than "The Life of Sri Aurobindo," because his life followed this sort of dialectical movement, you might say, from Europe to India, and then finally to a kind of transcultural synthesis in his later periods. And one could not have predicted where he would end up looking at the early period of his life. So I'll start with Sri Aurobindo. Now, these terms that I've used are a simplification, but just the periods themselves are very definite periods in Sri Aurobindo's life associated with different geographical locations. But the labels that one attaches to them are somewhat arbitrary in some cases. He was a professor for only about half of the years that he was in Baroda. Otherwise, he was the secretary of the Maharaja. His revolutionary activity really began around 1902, before he went to Calcutta. And he was already recognized as a yogi even before he arrived in Pondicherry, so that when he reached Pondicherry, he was hailed as the yogi from the north. Nevertheless, there are reasons for emphasizing his philosophical production in the first 10 years or so of his life in Pondicherry. And it was in the last period that he became a guru with an ashram and known as Sri Aurobindo. So there are, I think, fairly good reasons for selecting these particular descriptions of Sri Aurobindo in these different periods. So I'll start with Sri Aurobindo as a student in England from the age of 7. He was born in 1872, so at the age of 7, as he says, I'll read just a few basic statements by Sri Aurobindo about himself, which are published in a volume called Autobiographical Notes and Other Writings of Historical Interest. In order to understand the multicultural background of Sri Aurobindo's thought, one has to know a few basic facts about his life, which he himself explained in commenting on various attempts by others to write biographies of him. And so the autobiographical notes are corrections of statements made about him. beginning with this statement, Sri Aurobindo thought in English from his childhood and did not even know his native language, Bengali. At the age of 7, he was taken to England and remained there consecutively for 14 years, speaking English and thinking in English and no other tongue. Aurobindo gave his attention to the classics at Manchester and St. Paul's, but even at St. Paul's in the last 3 years, he simply went through his school course and spent most of his spare time in general reading, especially English poetry, literature, and fiction, French literature, and the history of ancient, medieval, and modern Europe. He had learned French from his childhood in Manchester and studied for himself German and Italian sufficiently to read Goethe and Dante in the original tongues. Finally, there was an attachment to English and European thought and literature, but not to England as a country. If there was attachment to a European land as a second country, it was intellectually and emotionally to one not seen or lived in this life, not England, but France. Now, the manuscript of what I just read is what is written in the left margin of this typescript, a typed copy of an attempt at a biography of Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo has underlined the phrase "all but adopted country," and in the left margin has commented and corrected that statement. The other statements that I've just read are found in similar manuscripts and take somewhat similar forms. In any case, it's a little, I won't try to read it again from the manuscript, but this is the format of what we call autobiographical notes. This is a fairly typical example. Another example, and this one is more important or is particularly important for the purpose of studying Sri Aurobindo's development as a philosopher, is this comment on a statement: Sri Aurobindo's intellect was influenced by Greek philosophy. That was number 3 in an itemized list of statements about Sri Aurobindo. And on this statement, Sri Aurobindo commented very little. In other words, his intellect was influenced very little by Greek philosophy. I read more than once Plato's Republic and Symposium, but only extracts from his other writings. It is true that under his impress, I rashly started writing at the age of 18 an explanation of the cosmos on the foundation of the principle of beauty and harmony, but I never got past the first 3 or 4 chapters. I read Epictetus and was interested in the ideas of the Stoics and the Epicureans, and I go on, I've transcribed what I just read here, and I've added a couple of sentences for the next from the next page. I made, in fact, no study of metaphysics in my school and college days. What little I knew about philosophy, I picked up desultorily in my general reading. So this particular document that I've just read a few sentences from is about 2 pages in the autobiographical notes, in which he makes a number of rather surprising statements. For example, one of the first things that most philosophers are struck by when they begin to read Sri Aurobindo is the apparent influence of Hegel. There's something very Hegelian about the structure of Sri Aurobindo's thought, but he insists in his autobiographical note on this statement: I once read not Hegel, but a small book on Hegel, but it left no impression on me. He goes on, German metaphysics and most European philosophy since the Greeks seemed to me a mass of abstractions written in a metaphysical jargon to which I had not the key. I tried once a translation of Kant, but dropped it after the first 2 pages and never tried again. In some, my interest in metaphysics was almost null, and in general philosophy, sporadic. So Sri Aurobindo, in other words, was not a born philosopher. We'll see how he came to write great philosophy a little bit later on. But let's start with his statement about the Platonic dialogue, which he says, started writing at the age of 18. It was, in fact, not so much an explanation of the cosmos as a study of ethics, as the title suggests. This fairly substantial piece of writing, it's published in the first volume of Sri Aurobindo's complete works, early cultural writings, we've called it, and it's called The Harmony of Virtue. It's about 70 pages in print, in 3 books, as he calls them. So the first book is a dialogue between a certain Keshav Ganesh. Keshav Ganesh is the name of one of the participants, and Broom Wilson. In fact, the only thing that might give us a clue to this piece of writing being by an Indian student is the name Keshav Ganesh, who plays the role of Socrates in this dialogue. We'll see in a moment how closely Sri Aurobindo has imitated the structure of a Platonic dialogue. But to begin with, it looks more like an exercise in writing, a literary exercise than a treatise on philosophy. I've shown the revision of the first couple of sentences, the revised version, revised in pencil, so you may not be able to see it very well, but my dear Broom, how opportune is your arrival. You will save me from the malady of work, it may be, from the dangerous opium of solitude. So far, there's nothing much very philosophical about this, unless perhaps it shows an influence of Epicureanism. But a little bit later, we do find Sri Aurobindo taking up a number of the main approaches to ethics, the different approaches to ethics which are discussed even today. The first being an example of the first of these is given here. I've taken a sentence from the previous page, and I've transcribed just the final revised version. So Keshav, now the first thing I want to point out about this is that Keshav, who is as I said, the Socrates of Sri Aurobindo's dialogue, does exactly what Socrates did. He asked question after question after question. Sometimes Socrates' questions go on for pages without a single declarative statement. And yet he leads his interlocutors usually to a flat contradiction of whatever opinion they started with. And so Sri Aurobindo has, on this particular or fragment of a page, had Keshav ask 5 questions, 3 of them shown here in the transcript. And do you cherish the opinion that your own peculiar creed, I believe it to be Christianity without Christ, is indubitably the most excellent of all religions? Wilson, by far the most excellent. Keshav, and your own ethical scheme, again, the Christian without the emotional element, the best of all ethical schemes. Wilson, I have no doubt of it. Keshav, and there are many who dissent from you, are there not? Oh, without doubt. Keshav, and you would impose your ethical scheme on them? Wilson, no, but I imagine it to be the goal whither all humanity is tending. Keshav, that is a very different question. Do you think that when a man's life is in harmony with his own creed, but not with yours, he is therefore not virtuous, but, or in your own phrase, deviates from his duty? Wilson, God forbid. So this is a sample of the kind of dialogue that Sri Aurobindo was writing here. He's discussing here, I think, what you could call a deontological approach to ethics. The word duty corresponds to that approach to ethics in terms of judging an action by the consequences of the act, but particularly whether the act agrees with certain rules of action or with one's duty. And these, of course, differ from one religion to another. So the point of this part of the dialogue is to show the relativity of all such schemes. So this is one approach to ethics, the idea of duty and rules of virtuous action. But a little bit later, yeah, that's a good idea.
It's 1 minute too much.
Yeah,
Talking about this.
it's
Or
well, okay.
definitely on
It's a little bit.
this is
high, but
that's
yeah,
okay.
oh, that's a good idea. Okay, a little bit later, we're now reading passages from the second. This is near the beginning of the second book of The Harmony of Virtue. Keshav asks a different interlocutor. Trevor has come in place of Broom Wilson. So you accept the dogma, the greatest good of the greatest number. For if one interest of a given person or number of persons conflict with another interest, you prefer the greater. This is what is called utilitarianism. It's a form of consequentialism where the action is judged strictly by the consequences of the act. So then Keshav goes on and takes his interlocutor by surprise. And so the Athenians were right when they put Socrates to death. Trevor, what makes you advance so absurd a paradox? Keshav, why, your arithmetical system of balancing the good and the evil. The injury to Socrates is not to be put in comparison with the profit to the state, for we prefer the good of the greater number. So he's gone on to a different approach to ethics and is considering the merits of this idea of the greatest good of the greatest number, which was very popular, in fact, in England at that time. Bentham had founded the philosophy of utilitarianism, I think, and J.S. Mill wrote a famous essay on this, which I remember reading in high school and being rather intrigued by this argument. Sri Aurobindo also comes back to it at various stages in his writings and often takes this as rather typical of the Western approach to ethics, which of course he doesn't accept. But now we come to something more along the lines of what Sri Aurobindo is getting at in this harmony of virtue. Keshav asks, may we not then say that the dominant principle regulating the variety of individual types is the evolution of individual as distinct from generic virtues? He's talking now about what is currently called virtue ethics, but virtue ethics is usually, in fact, discussed in terms of generic virtues, certain virtues which are considered to be common to all good people. But Sri Aurobindo has a different idea. Wilson says that is the logical consequence. Keshav continues, then the description of individual virtue runs thus. He's been working up to this. This is already the end of the second book. Individual virtue is the evolution by the human being of the inborn qualities and powers native to his personality. That is to say, just as every beautiful building has the solid earth for its basis, but is built in a distinct style of architecture, so the beautiful human soul will rest on the solid basis of humanity, but build up for itself a personality distinct and individual. So I'll come back to this formulation because this is actually a rather, as we'll see, a rather remarkable definition of individual virtue, the evolution by the human being of the inborn qualities and powers native to his personality. Towards the end of the third book now, which is where the harmony of virtue breaks off, he gives a very entertaining, let's say, example of what he means by virtue, individual virtue. We will call on the stage the girl and her lover who have been so useful to us. It is clear at once that if she is not virtuous, but harmonizes the elements of beauty unskillfully, the passion of her favorite will wither and not expand. So he has at this point in the dialogue defined virtuous as skillfully harmonizing the elements of beauty. So here in this case, it's a girl who has a talent for the art of seduction, as we'll see. Wilson, that is clear. Keshav, what then will be her manner of harmonizing them? Wilson, I return the question to you. Well now, will she not harmonize the phases of her dalliance and hesitate on the brink of yielding just at the proper pitch of his despair, and elude his kiss just at the proper pitch of his expectancy, and fan his longing when it sinks, and check it when it rises, and surrender herself when he is smoldering with hopeless passion? So Sri Aurobindo is clearly having fun writing this. We see, if nothing else, his talent as a writer, if not as a philosopher. But actually, this is a fairly respectable summary of some of the main approaches to ethics, I would say, for an 18-year-old. And not only that, but this here he's illustrating his definition of individual virtue, which I'll repeat here. Then the description of individual virtue runs thus: the evolution by the human being of the inborn qualities and powers native to his personality. 25 years later, after Sri Aurobindo had deeply steeped himself in Indian philosophy and spirituality, which he knew nothing about when he wrote The Harmony of Virtue, he writes on the second page of The Synthesis of Yoga, his major work on his method of spiritual practice: in the right view both of life and of yoga, all life is either consciously or subconsciously a yoga. For we mean by this term a methodized effort towards self-perfection by the expression of the secret potentialities latent in the being. What I want to point out is that individual virtue has become self-perfection. Evolution has been replaced by expression in this particular sentence, but a few sentences later, Sri Aurobindo says that yoga is actually a means of accelerating or compressing one's evolution. The inborn qualities and powers have become secret potentialities, and the phrase native to his personality has been replaced by latent in the being. But rather surprisingly, this formulation of the aim of a yoga of self-perfection can be seen as having evolved continuous with a certain continuity, even from his very early writings in England before he knew anything about yoga. So this is Sri Aurobindo's earliest substantial writing, which is a philosophical writing on ethics. How do we? Ethics is not a topic which figures very obviously in Sri Aurobindo's writings as a whole, and yet it's certainly there later on. And this is an example of what he says about ethics in the Synthesis of Yoga, in the third part of the Synthesis of Yoga. Ordinarily, ethics is regarded as a sort of machinery of right action. The act is everything, and how to do the right act is the whole question and the whole trouble. So, in fact, this view of ethics is what he was talking about in the first two books of The Harmony of Virtue, when he talked about various views of virtue in terms of rules of action or of a formula such as the greatest good of the greatest number. But he goes on now, to the yogin, action is chiefly important not for its own sake, but rather as a means for the growth of the soul Godward. Therefore, what Indian spiritual writings lay stress upon is not so much the quality of the action to be done as the quality of the soul from which the action flows, and upon the actions as their outflowings. Now, this may not correspond exactly to any recognized form of virtue ethics, but the basic difference between virtue ethics and the other approaches to ethics is the emphasis on the person rather than the act. And so this idea, which was already there in Sri Aurobindo's writings as an 18-year-old, has been developed further here in the synthesis of yoga. Now, why is this not? Can I? Okay, it's working now. Sri Aurobindo sometimes actually denied, because his conception of ethics didn't agree very well with what he says is the ordinary view of ethics. He denied that there is any ethics in his writings at all, in answer to someone who wrote to him saying they were thinking of writing a book on Sri Aurobindo's philosophy in 3 sections of metaphysics, psychology, and ethics. Sri Aurobindo replies, but why ethics? I don't think that there is any ethics, because ethics depends upon fixed principles and rules of conduct, whereas here any such thing can only be for sadhana purposes as conditions for getting the spiritual or higher consciousness, and afterwards everything is freely determined by that consciousness and its movements and dictates. But ethics, as understood philosophically, would include, I think, a supra-ethical aim to ethics, such as Sri Aurobindo preferred. And I think his view of ethics is pretty well summed up in this sentence in the chapter called "The Supra-Rational Good" in the Human Cycle, which was originally published under the title "The Psychology of Social Development." So this is around 1917. And if nature in man and the world is in its beginnings infra-ethical as well as infra-rational, as it is at its summit supra-ethical as well as supra-rational, yet in that infra-ethical there is something which becomes in the human plane of being the ethical, and that supra-ethical is itself a consummation of the ethical and cannot be reached by any who have not trod the long ethical road. So it's certainly not the case that Sri Aurobindo denied the importance of ethics, as we can see here. But I'm going to leave aside ethics now, and I'm also going to return to the chronological treatment of the periods of Sri Aurobindo's life. We come now to the Baroda period, about which Sri Aurobindo said in this statement in his autobiography, what we published, compiled as autobiographical notes. These were years of self-culture, of literary activity, and of preparation for future work. In England, he had received, according to his father's express instructions, an entirely Occidental education without any contact with the culture of India and the East. At Baroda, he made up the deficiency, learned Sanskrit and several modern Indian languages, assimilated the spirit of Indian civilization and its forms, past and present. So when Sri Aurobindo himself looked back on this second period of his life, he sees it primarily in terms of counteracting the occidentalization of his mind, the westernization that had been inflicted upon him in the first period of his life. So he made up this deficiency, and his other activities in this period as secretary to the Maharaja, as professor of English, even in Baroda College, were of relatively little interest, particularly since as a professor, his job was to prepare the students for the examinations, to follow a syllabus, which he found rather uninteresting. So he did that as a job. His real work in this period he regarded as preparing himself for his future work. And at this period, during this period, he wrote quite a lot of poetry, as he had already done in England, but I left that out. But the most successful of his early poems, and also the most interesting in relation to his later development, is the one called Love and Death, written in 1899 and based on a legend from the Mahabharata, which he was reading now at this time. At this point, instead of reading Homer and Virgil and so on, he was reading the Mahabharata, Ramayana, Kalidasa, and so on, and was steeping himself in Indian culture. So he took a rather little known episode from the Mahabharata in which a man brings his wife back from the dead. So it's called Love and Death. There's a confrontation between the lover and who loses his beloved, and the god of death. And Sri Aurobindo felt inspired in writing this poem, and actually the most interesting things about the poem are perhaps the process by which it was written and what he has to say about that, and the theme itself, which I'll come to. The poem itself, he wrote later, was written in a white heat of inspiration during 14 days of continuous writing, in the mornings only, of course, for I had to attend office the rest of the day and saw friends in the evening. I never wrote anything with such ease and rapidity before or after. He commented elsewhere on this state of mind. He was very interested in this state of mind that he calls inspiration. Everyone who has felt this state of mind can recall its main features. There is a sudden exaltation, a glow, an excitement, and a fiery and rapid activity of all the faculties. The impression we get is that thoughts are being breathed into us, expressions dictated, the whole poured in from outside. We'll be coming back to this theme of inspiration later on. With regard to the poem itself, we only have a typescript. The manuscript original, presumably there was a manuscript, but was not preserved. But even though the poem was inspired, nevertheless, Sri Aurobindo revised it in pen here. And so we see the revision of the opening lines. Later on, we come to the real theme of the poem, which is this confrontation between the human being and death. And Ruru, the lover, addresses death in these lines: "O secrecy terrific, darkness vast, at which we shudder. Somewhere, I know not where, somehow, I know not how, I shall confront thy gloom, tremendous spirit, and seize with hands, and prove what thou art and what man." What is remarkable about these lines is the way they foreshadow what Sri Aurobindo would write many years later when he took up another legend from the same Sanskrit epic, the Mahabharata, which also has to do with love and death, in which the roles of the man and the woman are reversed. It's the woman who brings the man, her husband, back from the dead, Savitri and Satyavan. And this became, in fact, Sri Aurobindo's major preoccupation as regards literary production in the last years of his life, and in fact he began to write it in 1916 and only finished it shortly before his passing in 1950. And it's the same theme as we already see dealt with here, even before the turn of the century in 1899 in Love and Death. Here is a passage from Savitri, written by a manuscript which Sri Aurobindo wrote somewhere between 1916 and 1920. It's rather hard to date these manuscripts exactly, but what's interesting about this particular manuscript is that we have both the original handwritten version, which begins, "Something stood there, unearthly, somber, grand, a limitless denial of all being, which wore the wonder of a shape," was the original line. The revision here is in a different handwriting. That's because Sri Aurobindo came back to this manuscript almost 30 years after he had originally written it, and by then his eyesight was failing and he was working by dictation. So his scribe, Nirobran, has written at Sri Aurobindo's dictation the revision of this line that wore the terror and wonder of a shape, making that a complete line. And then in its appalling eyes, the tenebrous form, this is in Nirobran's writing, bore the deep pity of destroying gods. There we go back 30 years or so to the original manuscript. A sorrowful irony curved the dreadful lips that speak the word of doom. In any case, it's basically the same theme as we had already seen in Love and Death many years earlier during Sri Aurobindo's Baroda period. Now let's go on to another important aspect of what Sri Aurobindo did during this period of self-culture, as he called it, in Baroda, which was that he read the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita during this period, as well as the literary works such as the Ramayana, Mahabharata, Kalidasa, and so on. So here, this particular piece of writing is actually a translation of Gaudapada's Karikas on the Mandukya Upanishad, on which Shankara commented. So the Mandukya Upanishad is one of the very important texts of the early Vedanta, a very short Upanishad which explains the symbolism of Om in terms of different states of consciousness, waking, dream, and deep sleep, and so on. So one of the early Vedantic thinkers before Shankara, Gaudapada, had written a series of verses called Karikas, on which Shankara a little bit later commented. Shankara, we're going to be meeting throughout this talk because Sri Aurobindo's engagement with Shankara went through several periods here. But what's interesting is this is quite early, around 1900, somewhere in the middle of the Baroda period. Sri Aurobindo first translates Gaudapada's Karika. Some who concern themselves with the cause of creation think that that almighty power is the origin of things, and by others creation is imagined as like to illusion or a dream. So this idea of illusion, the world as an illusion or a dream, is what we're going to see Sri Aurobindo dealing with for the next 40 years, actually, off and on, we can say, whenever the question of Shankara's philosophy, which was highly influential in India for more than 1,000 years, whenever that comes up, we are dealing with this idea of the world as an illusion. Maya is the Sanskrit term for it. Shankara comments in Sri Aurobindo's translation, those who concern themselves with creation, that is with the world, think that creation is the pervading power, the extension, so to speak, of God. but it is implied those who concern themselves with final and transcendental truth do not care about speculations on creation. Here, Shankara is making the distinction between transcendental truth, what is called paramartika in Sanskrit, and pragmatic truth when he refers to the speculations on creation, that is this world, vyavaharika. Shankara made a distinction between these two orders of reality, and Sri Aurobindo is going to be dealing with the question of whether Shankara has given a satisfactory solution to this problem of the supposed illusory nature of existence. But a few years later, we have Sri Aurobindo commenting on another Upanishad, the Isha Upanishad. This is going to become particularly important in Sri Aurobindo's writings. His commentaries on this, again, very short Upanishad, only 18 verses. But Sri Aurobindo is going to write a series of 10 commentaries, none of them complete, well, not fragmentary. Some of them run to more than 100 pages in print, but incomplete. And then finally, one commentary which he published. And in the course of that, we can see the early evolution of his philosophy now that he's come under the influence of Indian thought. So we're at a new stage in the development of Sri Aurobindo's philosophy. This quite long commentary takes the form of a dialogue, but it's nothing like the Socratic dialogue or Platonic dialogue that we saw before. It's modeled somewhat more on the dialogue in the Bhagavad Gita between Krishna and Arjuna. Here we have the guru and the student. This is a transcript of what I just showed. And the main points are that the student asks, why then does Shankara say that it is necessary to give up works in order to attain absolute unity? This is one of the main questions Sri Aurobindo is going to be dealing with in his critique of traditional Indian philosophy, the tendency towards asceticism, towards associating spirituality with sannyasa, renunciation, giving up life in this world. And at this point, the guru, Sri Aurobindo, is using the persona of the guru to give his own interpretation of Vedanta at this point, which when he was in his early 30s now, the later part of his period in Baroda, he defends Shankara in spite of the fact that Sri Aurobindo was totally against giving up works as necessary for spiritual realization. He says there was a reason for what Shankara said, and it was necessary in his age that jnana should be exalted at the expense of works, and so on. I won't read all of this because, yeah, okay. I'm going to have to speed up a little bit. But in any case, later on in the same dialogue, he gives his interpretation of Vedanta at this point. The whole confusion in this matter proceeds from an imperfect understanding of mukti, liberation. For why do men fly from action and shun their kartavya karma, work to be done, in the pursuit of mukti? It is because they dread to be cast again into bondage, to lose their chance of mukti. Yet what is mukti? It is release from what? From avidya, ignorance, from the great nescience, from the belief that you are limited and bound, who are illimitable, Brahman, and cannot be bound. The moment you have realized that avidya is an illusion, that there is nothing but Brahman and never was nor will be anything but Brahman, realized it, I say, had anubhava, experience of it, not merely intellectually grasped the idea. This is from the next page. From that moment, you are free and always have been free. So this is Sri Aurobindo's understanding of Shankara's interpretation of Vedanta at this point. Now, Sri Aurobindo is not going to remain satisfied with this view of Vedanta, particularly the idea um, expressed here that you who are illimitable Brahman have always been free, and nothing really happens when you achieve freedom, since you were free all along. He's going to, in fact, later on criticize this, because according to Shankara, the individual soul is an illusion, the world is an illusion, and therefore the liberation of the illusory soul from the illusory world is also illusory. And so what's the point of it all? That's what Sri Aurobindo is going to write about 10 years later. But at this point, he's giving his interpretation of Shankara. Nevertheless, I think more characteristic of Sri Aurobindo's approach to the Upanishads at this stage is seen in this passage, which I've transcribed here, where he explains the Upanishads in terms of Shakespeare. He had grown up, of course, with Shakespeare. He was just reading the Upanishads for the first time in Baroda, but he had grown up with Shakespeare, and his natural way of understanding things is to relate the new thing that he was learning, which is Vedanta, to what he already knew was the plays of Shakespeare. And so he writes, the Purusha, the soul, is really unmoving. He is the motionless and silent spectator of a drama of which he himself is the stage, the theater, the scenery, the actors, and the acting. He is the poet Shakespeare watching Desdemona and Othello, Hamlet and the murderous uncle, Rosalind and Jaques and Viola, and all the other 100 multiplicities of himself, acting and talking and rejoicing and suffering, all himself and yet not himself, who sits there a silent witness, their creator, who has no part in their actions, and yet without him, not one of them could exist. This is the mystery of the world and its paradox, yet it's one plain, simple, and easy truth. So all the world's a stage, and this is true whether you are a scholar of Shakespeare or a philosopher of Vedanta. Now, Sri Aurobindo rewrote this whole commentary on the Isha Upanishad in a different form, dropping the dialogue format, under the title The Karma Yogin, a word which we are familiar with mainly from the Bhagavad Gita, not from the Upanishads. The Karma Yogin, a commentary on the Isha Upanishad. What is particularly interesting about the manuscript itself is that it has on it the stamp of the Alipur court. In other words, it was seized from Sri Aurobindo's room when he was arrested at the beginning of May 1908. And it came to the ashram and the archives only several decades later. So Sri Aurobindo never saw this manuscript again, but it allows us at least to date the manuscript as being before 1908, probably a couple of years before that. Incidentally, the small NBG22 in the upper left-hand corner was not written there by the Alipur court, but by the archives. This is notebook general number 22 in the archives classification of Sri Aurobindo's manuscripts. So this is as more or less a rewriting of the previous commentary on the Isha Upanishad, but this statement is particularly striking. So Shankara disparages karma, and Shankaracharya is an authority which no man can dare to belittle. Nevertheless, even the greatest are conditioned by their nature, by the times they work in, and by the kind of work they have come to do. In the age that Shankara lived in, it was right that jnana should be exalted at the expense of works. We've already seen a similar passage in the previous version of this commentary. But the statement Shankaracharya, acharya is simply teacher, the great teacher Shankara. His authority is something that no man can dare to belittle, according to Sri Aurobindo writing sometime before 1908. Now, this attitude towards Shankara is not going to last very much longer. We're going to see fairly soon that Sri Aurobindo's attitude towards Shankara had changed. I think.
Yeah, no,
Yeah, okay. So we go on now to Sri Aurobindo's period as a revolutionary, where he puts the karma yoga, the yoga of action, in other words, spirituality practiced through selfless action in the world. He puts that into practice as a leader of the Indian freedom struggle. It's a very brief but very eventful period. And this is when Sri Aurobindo suddenly became known. Up until August 18th, 1907, Sri Aurobindo was completely and utterly unknown. It's hard for us to even imagine how unknown he was up to that day. On that day, the news broke that he was being prosecuted as the editor of the political journal Bande Mataram. And he became famous suddenly overnight, much to his chagrin. He wrote later on, I was never ardent about fame. Even in my political days, I preferred to remain behind the curtain, push people without their knowing it, and get things done. It was the confounded British government that spoiled my game by prosecuting me and forcing me to be publicly known and a quote leader. So a little bit after the sudden publicity that he received on September 29th, 1907, the weekly edition of Bande Mataram shows his picture on the front. They showed a different person each week. So it's not because Sri Aurobindo was the editor that his picture is on the front, but at this point, it was no longer a secret that Sri Aurobindo was the editor of this highly influential political journal. So this is his period of political journalism. It's quite different from all the writings. What he wrote during this period is quite different from anything that he wrote before or after, except for the skill of the writing, which he refers to here in a statement taken again from autobiographical notes. Sri Aurobindo had always taken care to give no handle in the editorial articles of the Bande Mataram, either for a prosecution for sedition or any other drastic action fatal to its existence. An editor of The Statesman, which was a British magazine, complained that the paper reeked with sedition patently visible between every line, but it was so skillfully written that no legal action could be taken. And in fact, Sri Aurobindo was acquitted. The printer was prosecuted, but Sri Aurobindo was acquitted in this case. I'll just give one example of Sri Aurobindo's writing from this period, because it should be kept in mind that although Sri Aurobindo is referred to as a nationalist during this period, the party of which he was one of the leaders was called the Nationalists. This was a very cosmopolitan kind of nationalism. And also Sri Aurobindo was a recognized figure in the movement of Pan-Asianism, as we see here, where he writes, there are periods in the history of the world when the unseen power that guides its destinies seems to be filled with a consuming passion for change. Such a period was the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th. In such a period, we find ourselves at the dawn of this 20th century. The result of the earlier disturbance was the birth of a new Europe and the modernization of the Western world. We are assisting now at the birth of a new Asia and the modernization of the East. So I'll go on to the next period. We come now to the periods of Sri Aurobindo's life, which are of the greatest importance in that his writings, what we now regard as Sri Aurobindo's major works, all come from these last two periods. And yet, although I've called this period Sri Aurobindo the philosopher, he continued to write poetry, and perhaps surprisingly, his first major project was a Homeric epic called Ilion, or originally called The Fall of Troy, an epic. He wasn't finding it so easy to leave his Western upbringing behind him, his training in the classics. And so here he's come to Pondicherry as the yogi from the north, and the first thing he does is to write a poem set in ancient Greece, or the Trojan War. And what is particularly interesting about Ilion is, as we read at the bottom of the last page of the first version of Book 1 of Ilion, because Sri Aurobindo is going to spend quite a lot of time in the next few years on Ilion before he takes up Savitri. He wrote, commenced in jail 1909, resumed and completed in Pondicherry April and May 1910. We know from other statements that in jail he was not allowed to have any writing materials. So nevertheless, he composed poetry and he had to memorize it. So he composed lines from Ilion in jail and memorized them and wrote them down later on. So he's come back to it almost immediately after his arrival in Pondicherry on April 4th, 1910. We find him writing Ilion and a play called Erik, which is set in Norway. So this is the opening, just to give a taste of Ilion, the opening of Book 8, the Book of the Gods. It would be a few years before he wrote Book 8, but so on the earth, the seed that was sown of the centuries ripened. Europe and Asia met on their borders, clashed in the Troad. All over earth, men wept and bled and labored, worldwide, sowing fate with their deeds, and had other fruit than they hoped for. So you have the Homeric rhythm of the dactylic hexameter being used to depict a sort of clash of civilizations. Europe and Asia met on their borders, clashed in the Troad. So let's go on to some of the other things he was doing at this time, writing commentaries on the Veda. One of the things he was most preoccupied with after he came to Pondicherry for the first few years was the interpretation of the Rig Veda. One of his best known writings from this period is his Thoughts and Aphorisms. He didn't publish them, but they were published later on and became quite popular. The first page is shown here, and this is an example. I'll just read one of these aphorisms because it relates to what we saw before about the experience of inspiration, which he had had in writing Love and Death. Inspiration is a slender river of brightness leaping from a vast and eternal knowledge. It exceeds reason more perfectly than reason exceeds the knowledge of the senses. So he's speaking of inspiration here, not just as a source of poetry, but as a means of knowledge, a supra-intellectual, supra-rational means of knowledge. Now, another one of these aphorisms brings us back to Sri Aurobindo's relation with Shankara. You remember he had said Shankara is an authority which no man can dare to belittle. Now he writes, 3 times God laughed at Shankara. First, when he returned to burn the corpse of his mother after decrying, denigrating Vedic ritualism. Again, when he commented on the Isha Upanishad, and the third time when he stormed about India preaching inaction. Of particular interest is the mention of the commentary on the Isha Upanishad, because at this time, Sri Aurobindo took up again the Isha Upanishad and wrote a series of commentaries which he called the Life Divine. Now, the Life Divine, the title, The Life Divine, is well known to anyone who knows anything about Sri Aurobindo, but most people associate it with a book of original philosophy of over 1,000 pages, which Sri Aurobindo entitled The Life Divine. But that great work of his own philosophy was preceded by commentaries on the Isha Upanishad. His last 3 commentaries on the Isha Upanishad were called The Life Divine. And here we have one of the notebooks that he used. We call them the King and Queen notebooks. These were the cheapest notebooks that you could get in the bazaar. And Sri Aurobindo was very short on money at this time. So his immortal writings are in these student exercise books. So this may be a little bit difficult to read, but the bottom part of the page was the original writing. What is it that the Upanishad reveals? This is the question I have set myself to answer. I am indifferent to what set of warring philosophical dogmas its texts can be made in armory. But that led him to a reflection which he's put at the top of the page, which is of more interest. And I've transcribed that here. Nevertheless, in the course of exegesis, I have been compelled to come into conflict with the opinions of the Mayavada, illusionism. The collision was inevitable rather than desired, for the Mayavada was the opinion with which I commenced my study of Vedanta. We saw that in the previous period in Baroda, where he wrote commentaries on the Isha Upanishad. He was summarizing Shankara's interpretation of Vedanta, even when he sometimes already was questioning Shankara's interpretation of certain phrases in the text of the Isha Upanishad itself. In fact, in Sri Aurobindo's relation with Shankara, there are basically 3 elements. His view of Shankara as a commentator, as an exegete, commenting on the Upanishads and Gita, the Vedantic texts. Then Shankara as a metaphysician, his own philosophy. This is the aspect of Shankara that Sri Aurobindo is going to take up most seriously much later in his last period, and we may not even have time for that today. But also his view of the influence, the effect that Shankara's philosophy had on Indian culture, the Indian life, as he says here he's gone actually back a page and written in the margin of the previous page at the top. It is a system which still attracts the abstract intellectuality in me and represents to me what I may call an intervening and mediary truth of realization, which can never lose its validity. But when it seeks to govern human thought and life, to perpetuate itself as the sole truth of Vedanta, I feel that it is in conflict with the old Vedanta, stultifies the Upanishad, and endangers or sterilizes all our highest human activities without giving us the highest spiritual truth in its place. So here he's coming down pretty hard on Shankara. First of all, as a commentator, he criticizes Shankara's whole method, that he's not really commenting on the Upanishad, but using the Upanishad to support his own philosophy. His main authority is his own preconceived view of Vedanta, a standard external to the text and insofar illegitimate. The next Life Divine commentary on the Isha Upanishad contains this passage in which Sri Aurobindo compares Shankara with Buddha, particularly in that he drives like Buddha straight at the actual fact of our bondage, the practical cause of bondage and the most direct path of escape from the bondage. The intellectual difference between the 2 systems is immense, but their temperamental kinship is close. Yet, Shankara's system, he points out, less intellectually nihilistic than Buddha's, has been more practically has been practically more fatal to the activities of the divine power and joy in life in the nation which has so largely accepted his teachings. This is, in fact, his most serious criticism of Shankara was the effect that it had on India for the next many centuries. So now we come to a period for which there are very few manuscripts, because we come now to the writings that Sri Aurobindo published in the Arya. I'll go as quickly as possible over these writings in order to get to the next period where we again have manuscript writings. But Sri Aurobindo's major works were almost all published during this period. And at this time, he dropped the title, The Life Divine, from his commentaries on the Isha Upanishad and published a commentary, a translation of the Isha Upanishad and a commentary, simply called Commentary. Here he points out his criticism of Shankara in that Shankara commented on the Isha Upanishad. That was one of the three reasons God laughed at him. It is the sole Upanishad which offered almost insuperable difficulties to the extreme illusionism and anti-pragmatism of Shankara. Oh, what's particularly interesting is his use of the phrase extreme illusionism, because about 25 years later, Sri Aurobindo is going to come back to Shankara and write at great length in his revision of the Life Divine, the Life Divine, the great philosophical work of that title, which also began to appear in the Arya at the same time. There, Sri Aurobindo is going to he's going to tone down his criticism of Shankara, although still refuting his metaphysics, but he refers to it there as a qualified illusionism, whereas here it's an extreme illusionism. So from the deferential attitude toward Shankara in his Baroda period, when Shankara's authority cannot be belittled, to God laughing at Shankara in the next period, we're going to have him giving a more nuanced but also much more detailed critique of Shankara in 1940 when he revises the Life Divine. But in the original Life Divine, here we're reading from the Arya, which I'll come to now, in the 5th chapter called The Destiny of the Individual, Sri Aurobindo points out what I already mentioned. Who then profits by this escape, the escape of the individual soul from the ignorance? Not the supreme self, for it is supposed to be always inalienably free, still, silent, pure. Not the world, for that remains constantly in the bondage and is not freed by the escape of any individual soul from the universal illusion. It is the individual soul itself which effects its supreme good by escaping from the sorrow and the division into the peace and the bliss. But for the illusionist, the individual soul is an illusion and non-existent except in the inexplicable mystery of Maya. So the conclusion is, Maya meets us even in our escape and laughs at the triumphant logic which seemed to cut the knot of her mystery. So God laughs at Shankara, now Maya laughs at Shankara. Sri Aurobindo's attitude toward Shankara has gone almost to the other extreme now at this stage. And so this is our introduction to the Arya. The Arya is the monthly journal in which Sri Aurobindo was going to publish most of his major works, all of his major prose works. Just before the first issue appeared in June 1914, Sri Aurobindo writes, in this review, my new theory of the Veda will appear as also a translation and explanation of the Upanishads, a series of essays giving my system of yoga, and a book of Vedantic philosophy. You will see, so far as my share is concerned, it will be the intellectual side of my work for the world. So this is the Secret of the Veda, the commentary on the Isha Upanishad, the synthesis of yoga, and the life divine. And in the French edition, because the aria appeared originally in French as well as in English, we have at the top of the second page three of these topics: des études synthétiques de philosophie spéculative, that would be the life divine; des traductions et des commentaires de textes anciens, that would be the secret of the Veda, and the commentary on the Isha and later the Kena Upanishad. Then the last, des méthodes pratiques de culture intérieure et de développement individuel, that's the synthesis of yoga. The third topic, des études de religion comparée, was what Paul Richard was interested in, who was the other editor of the Revue de Grande Synthèse Philosophique, as it was called. The title Arya was given only in Devanagari. So for those who didn't know Devanagari, they wouldn't have even known they were reading a journal called Arya. And the names of the directeur are given. Sri Aurobindo Ghosh is not yet Sri Aurobindo. In fact, he's usually referred to as Aurobindo Ghosh. And in the contents, that is then further is abbreviated to AG. And Paul Mira Richard. So we meet here for the first time a key person in Sri Aurobindo's life, and the event of the coming of Mira Alfassa, as she's usually referred to by her maiden name, or more often the mother, as she came to be known somewhat later. Her coming was a crucial event, which I won't comment on now. Sri Aurobindo felt it necessary to explain the meaning of Arya because of unfortunate associations, which became much worse after this period, the racist associations of the word Arya. He had to take trouble to explain that he meant it in a Vedic sense of the highest aspirations of the human race. But in spite of giving the name, a name drawn from ancient India to the journal, he was really more interested in the thought of the future, as he explained in an article at the beginning of the second year of the Arya. Our review has been conceived neither as a mirror of the fleeting interests and surface thoughts of the period we live in, nor as the mouthpiece of a sect, school, or already organized way of thinking. Its object is to feel out for the thought of the future, to help in shaping its foundations, and to link it to the best and most vital thought of the past. Okay, but I have to do the next few at least. I can't stop here.
No.
I have to at least finish this. Okay, so with regard to the writing of the Arya, Sri Aurobindo commented on something which I think anybody who closely studies the writings leading up to the Arya and then the Arya itself would be struck by, that there's an extraordinary difference between what Sri Aurobindo had written up to just a few months before the Arya began, and the very first chapters that came out in the Arya. And Sri Aurobindo himself commented on that and said in the 1930s, the quote, latent philosopher failed to come out at the first shot when I was in Calcutta, where he wrote some short philosophical articles in the journals that he was editing at that time. After some years of incubation, with a question mark, which is there in the manuscript, it burst out like a volcano as soon as I started writing the Arya. Actually, that's hardly an exaggeration, because when we look at the writings that appeared in the Arya, he was writing 6 to 7 books at a time. And these are massive works, and yet he seemed to have a complete control over the pacing so that he could bring a book to an end at the end, to a conclusion at the end of a year of the Arya. Many of his books ended because the Arya was launched in August of 1914. Many of his books end in a July issue. And therefore, many of his books have multiples of 12 chapters, or if it's not exactly a multiple of 12, there's a reason for it. But in any case, when Sri Aurobindo says that he wrote the aria, it's not quite true. He typed the aria. He typed directly on the typewriter, which for our purpose means that we don't have any manuscripts, and the typescripts were not preserved. This is said to be the typewriter that Sri Aurobindo actually used. After the aria, Sri Aurobindo never typed again, but his writings were typed for him from the manuscripts by one of his senior disciple, Nalini Kantagupta, who had come with him, had also come down from Calcutta when Sri Aurobindo came to Pondicherry, and was Sri Aurobindo's secretary, you could say, but typed thousands of pages of very difficult manuscripts. Sometimes not directly from the manuscripts, but so maybe perhaps I should lower that to hundreds of pages. It was Nirodbaran who copied some of the most difficult manuscripts and also played the role of taking dictation from Sri Aurobindo when Sri Aurobindo's eyesight failed. So these were two key figures who collaborated with Sri Aurobindo in the actual process of the writing of his works. The typewriter remained important after Sri Aurobindo's passing up to the 1980s. It was only in the mid-1980s that the archives acquired its first personal computer. In the early days of the archives, transcriptions were done on a typewriter. And we unfortunately lost one of our most valuable members a few months ago, who not only typed thousands, literally thousands of pages of Sri Aurobindo's writings, but photocopied those manuscripts and later scanned them digitally. So the fact that I'm giving this talk is due to her work. As I mentioned, by 1916, Sri Aurobindo was writing at least 6 books at once. In fact, in December, he added one more book, Heraclitus, the series of 7 essays on Heraclitus, which he also published in the 3rd year of the aria. But as if that was not enough, he also decided to write an epic poem in the same month as the August 1916 issue of the aria. We find the first draft of what eventually was going to become his epic, Savitri, a legend and a symbol. Here in an early manuscript, it's called Savitri, a tale and a vision. And so it gradually grew into almost a counterpart of his philosophy, almost like the life divine in poetry in a certain sense. And Sri Aurobindo was very interested in this convergence of philosophy and poetry. One of the books that he wrote in the aria, published in the aria, was The Future Poetry. There he points out the difference between the way the philosopher sees in the dry light of the reason, etc., and the way the poetic mind sees in a flood of colored light. And yet he also adds, the first effort of philosophy is to know for the sake of pure understanding, but her greater height is to take truth alive in the spirit and clasp and grow one with her and be consciously within ourselves all the reality we have learned to know. But that is precisely what the poet strives to do in his own way by intuition and imagination, when he labors to bring himself close to and be won by delight with the thing of beauty which awakes his joy. He does not always seize the very self of the thing, but to do so lies within his power. The language of intuitive thinking moves always, therefore, to an affinity with poetic speech. So this concludes more or less I was going to say something about the booklets that came out of which War and Self-Determination was one. For the next 20 years after Sri Aurobindo discontinued the Arya, his only major work that is going to be available in print is Essays on the Gita, which he revised in the 1920s. But otherwise, his writings were known for about 20 years, mostly through small collections of essays, which were also published in the Arya and collected in booklets like this one, War and Self-Determination, under titles like The Superman, Evolution, Ideals and Progress. In the 1930s, there would be booklets of his letters, The Riddle of This World, Bases of Yoga, Lights on Yoga, and so on. It's only in 1939 and 40 that Sri Aurobindo is going to come back to the Life Divine and thoroughly revise Book 2 of the Life Divine, especially. We won't, unfortunately, have time to look at that today. But I've completed 4 of my 5 sections of the talk.
Thank you
So
very
I
much.
think this
So you
is a
can
good.
come again to develop further the 5th session.
This is about halfway.
Thanks a lot. So keep connected, and we wait for episode 2 very soon.
Okay.
And in the meantime, we leave the floor to Lorenzo, thanking him very much.
Well, thank you, Richard. It was really fascinating to listen to all this work. So many ideas, so many questions have I to express. But first of all, could you tell us something about the manuscripts and how are they? It's difficult to work on, because I saw you reading directly on the manuscript. I couldn't, but I tried to. I just tried to do that. How can you go so far and so fast in?
Well, I've been doing it for 45 years.
Of course, but well, just to have something more about the personality of Sri Aurobindo through his way of writing. So we have
his early manuscripts are actually quite neat, but about somewhere in the period that we've come to here, his writings became increasingly illegible, especially during the 1930s. I wasn't actually planning to say very much about that period anyway. That was when he wrote the hundreds of letters that are collected in 7 volumes of the complete works. 4 volumes of letters on yoga, letters on himself and the ashram, letters on the mother, and letters on poetry and art. He was staying up all night writing letters, and the format of his letters, they weren't, you think of someone taking out a blank, even in the old days when one wrote letters by hand, writing on a blank sheet of paper. Actually, the members of the ashram were keeping diaries of all their experiences and problems and so on. And Sri Aurobindo was writing his comments in the margin or between the lines or whatever space he could find. And he was doing it in the middle of the night. And he was doing it at tremendous speed because he wanted to get some sleep by at least by the morning. And so he got in the habit of writing more and more illegibly. And so, especially when his eyesight failed on top of the speed with which he wrote, it does become difficult to read his handwriting. I didn't. I could actually. There's no reason I shouldn't. I think can I go quickly until here we had one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this series. This is an example of his handwriting in 1947. This was his very last notebook, which he used for writing. there's a transcription of it. With the help of the transcription below, you can more or less read it. But this does, even for someone who spent their whole life reading Sri-Aurobindo's manuscripts, I admit that there are times when I'm not really quite sure about the reading.
Also, you always see the evolution in the way,
Yeah.
you know, an author writes, but in the case of Sri Aurobindo, it's really remarkable sometimes when you compare different manuscripts, you barely recognize the handwriting. It's very different in different times.
Yeah, it's very different. He looks like different people. I mean, you know.
That's very interesting because you started saying that when he was in England, he used to think in English.
Yeah.
And then when he comes to India, and does he still continue thinking English all his
No,
lifelong?
He did continue to think in English. He makes that clear, even though he immersed himself in Sanskrit and Bengali. He learned Bengali well enough that he could edit a journal in Bengali and write a lot of articles and write poetry in Bengali. But still, he could never give a speech in Bengali. All his speeches were given in English. He clearly never thought in Bengali. He makes it clear that he not only wrote but spoke in English as his natural language.
I understand.
Which means that once he's assimilating Indian culture, he's assimilating it into the consciousness of an English speaking person. And so there's a process of translation that's constantly going on, even though he uses as much Sanskrit as he thinks his readers can tolerate. And we see that in his diary when he's not worried about the readers. His diary is just peppered with Sanskrit. So he thought in English, but using a lot of Sanskrit words, which for him were the most precise terms corresponding to his experiences. I think he spoke in Bengali, but he didn't venture to give a public speech in Bengali. I think and most of the people that he associated with spoke English very well, and so I think he mostly spoke in English, but he could. No. That's, yeah. One wonders whether whether he had to struggle with his failing eyesight without the benefit of glasses, but he never used glasses.
Another astonishment for me from the way you presented, well, the life of Sri Aurobindo. No, you said that there's periods very defined. School professor. He was a president of a university in Baroda.
Yeah, and actually, that also extends. That again, there's an overlap because when he first went to Calcutta, he was the principal of the newly founded Bengal National College and was also a professor for a year. He resigned when a political case against him came. But,
and then there's the revolutionary period.
Yeah, the revolutionary,
the political period.
Yeah.
And then the philosopher. Well, that's my notes. The philosophic period, and then the yogic period.
Yeah.
My question would be, do you think, relating to the idea of ethics in particular, do you think that there is a red line that it's possible to follow, going through the first period and then till the last period? Or Sri Aurobindo is going from political to ethic or to his yogi activity like this?
Objectively, he was, but actually I was trying to bring that out. I made a point of bringing that out, and I don't think it's been done sufficiently to show the continuity, even with his very early writings as a student. In fact, I hadn't really even noticed this myself until I started preparing this presentation. I wanted to show some of those manuscripts, and I took a closer look at you know, the harmony of virtue, which I'd
Yeah.
never taken very seriously. And I realized that there's a lot more continuity.
Yeah, in particular between ethics
yeah,
and politics.
Yeah, right.
The way he understands the action, the political action,
right, exactly.
With the
That's
idea
a
of
good
the
point.
action in ethics.
Yeah.
But you said, but there's no ethics at a certain
He
point.
said that was his response to, when someone proposed to write about his ethics. But then if you look closely at his writings, you find that there's plenty of ethics, which is quite explicit. And in any case, karma yoga really is a philosophy of ethics.
Yeah. And so that's very interesting to follow this conception, the idea of ethics in the way of behaving politically, because he is a revolutionary.
Yeah, right.
He is trying to liberate India from the English.
Yeah.
But the way he does it, the way he proposes a political action, I guess it's in continuity with his idea of ethics.
It certainly is. Yeah, he does it as karma yoga, and as I just said, I think karma yoga is, you know, Indian ethics. Hasn't been very much discussion of ethics in Indian philosophy. There's lots of discussion of Chinese ethics and very often compared with virtue ethics in the West. There is 1 2-volume set on Indian ethics, which is very good. And it does make the point that Indian ethics also tends towards what in the West is called virtue ethics.
Yes, definitely, yeah.
And Sri Aurobindo's ethics is of that type. But he wasn't, I don't think he was even familiar with the concept of virtue ethics as such, really. And he hadn't studied philosophy, including ethics, systematically. So I think his statement that there's no ethics in his philosophy was based on a certain understanding of ethics, which is not exactly the way philosophers use the word nowadays.
But doesn't he explain, or at least to a certain extent, in this book, The Future of Poetry, doesn't he develop the concept of ethics?
Oh, the future poetry is his aesthetics rather than his ethics. But what's interesting is the way they overlap, because the ethics of the harmony of virtue is an aesthetic ethics.
Yes.
The harmony of beauty, you know, beauty of character is what he's trying to bring out. Anyway, yeah, he was naturally inclined towards aesthetics as a poet. He didn't think of himself as moralistic. I think he wanted to distance himself from Victorian moralism. That may be one of his reasons for downplaying the role of ethics in his writings. But I think it's something that needs to be studied a lot more. Actually, one of my main purposes here was to sort of locate research topics, things that haven't been, I haven't been trying to present an interpretation of Sri Aurobindo's writings, but to show how the manuscripts raise all sorts of questions that need to be studied.
Indeed.
Yeah, but maybe they have some questions too. I don't want to monopolize.
Please do monopolize.
So maybe my last question, it's the relationship to philosophy.
Yeah,
because listening to you, it sounds a little bit complicated, because Aurobindo himself said, "I'm not a philosopher."
Right.
I'm not a philosopher in the Western sense of it.
Well, there's that, yeah.
But on the other hand, it's quite clear there are, at least listening to you, that you cannot think of Schopenhauer. You cannot think about Bergson for the intuition. So there is something very close to the idea of Aurobindo. William James, we were talking about that in the cafe before, for the idea of psychology, of the idea of ego, of emotions. And another one is Spinoza.
Yeah.
So I found in my library, first time I came to Paris, I I encountered this book on Spinoza and Sri Aurobindo, Erreur, Ignorance et Illusion by Jean-Michel Terjman, that I don't know. But it's the only book I know, as far as I know, that compares the thought of Aurobindo with another philosopher, like Spinoza. But you told me that he never quotes, never speaks a word about Spinoza.
The name may be mentioned just in passing, but no, he refers to pantheism.
Yes.
And so when he talks about pantheism, he's probably thinking of Spinoza, because in the history of Western philosophy, it's mainly Spinoza who represents pantheism. Sri Aurobindo distinguishes Western pantheism from Vedantic pantheism, as you could call it.
Yes.
But it doesn't sound as if he was very familiar with what he calls Western, the Western version of pantheism. So, but in any case, that certainly is an interesting topic, Sri Aurobindo and Spinoza. As I was telling you, I started with Spinoza and then went to almost directly to Sri Aurobindo. So for me, at least, that seems quite natural.
And also, I would say that this question about what was philosophy for Sri Aurobindo is something that it's a question that maybe would deserve some research on the topics. You were quoting a couple of passages where actually one could have easily conclude that basically metaphysics and philosophy are taken for synonymous. Almost.
Exactly.
And then at another point, he is reacting to this commentary on his work, articulating his work in metaphysics, psychology, and ethics. And then, of course, you have all these assessments about the fact that he, this philosophical output didn't come out at first end, but only during the Arya period. And at the same time, as I've tried to show in my presentation last month, it's a curious definition of philosophy what Arya showcases on the end. So I think maybe this is also a topic on which we could try to do some research together.
One also has to keep in mind that the statements in which Sri Aurobindo said that he was not a philosopher, these were written during a particular period when he was overwhelmed by correspondence. He was trying to leave philosophy behind at that point, but he didn't succeed because he came back to philosophy, or philosophy came back to him with a vengeance. As soon as that period of day and night correspondence was over, he had an accident at the end of 1938, which meant that he had to stop all the correspondence. And it was during that period that he revised the Life Divine. And when he revised the Life Divine, he at first revised it, the whole of book one, he didn't revise very extensively, except for adding a whole new chapter at the end to kind of update book one of the Life Divine in the light of the later developments of his yoga, especially his spiritual experience. But when he came to book two, suddenly he started writing long chapters. These chapters were no longer constrained by the limitations of space, which he had in the Arya, which was 64 pages a month for, 6 or 7 different books. So each one could not be more than 10 pages or so. He started writing 40-page chapters of which were entirely new. And when he came to Shankara, or when he came to the question of the cosmic illusion, rather, let's say, the idea, he felt that he had not sufficiently dealt with this idea that had been so powerful for centuries in India, that the world is Maya, is in the sense of illusion. And so he started to write a chapter called Reality and the Cosmic Illusion. that went on expanding and expanding. It became 2 chapters, one called The Cosmic Illusion, Mind, Dream, Hallucination, the second one called Reality and the Cosmic Illusion. And that second one is more than 40 pages long in print. And it's there that he really takes up Shankara seriously. That's where he calls Shankara's Mayavada a qualified illusionism, and he distinguishes it from other forms of illusionism. He makes very fine distinctions between different possible ways of seeing the world as an illusion. And he really writes philosophy like he had never done before. I mean, his most serious philosophy was written in that period, which was like, it was as if the volcano had gone dormant for 20 years and there was suddenly another eruption. And then it went dormant again, and he turned his attention to poetry and didn't write much more in the way of philosophy.
And if I may add just a final word, because we really need to wrap as our colleagues are arriving, and here at École Normale we are all fighting. Maybe we can discuss later or together. It's just that trying to pointing out topics that can be analyzed in the manuscripts and seen together in future. There's this very peculiar use of titles circulating from a work to another, Karma Yogi,
right.
Divine.
Exactly.
And this is one more common point with Nietzsche, not because in Nietzsche there are titles circulating from a work with another, but there is in Nietzsche as well a sort of art of the title. Sometimes in Nietzsche you have titles without work, just sketches of a book to be that would never come out. So
we've used some of Sri Aurobindo's unused titles for volumes of the complete works of Sri Aurobindo.
Yes, because there was
Essays Divine and Human, Essays in Philosophy and Yoga. Those were Sri Aurobindo's own titles, but he never used them. He never wrote the books.
So another topic on which we can keep on discussing. I would like. Sorry, I need to cut the session. Thank you very much to our honorable guests who came and discussed these beautiful topics. We really hope this is just the beginning of a whole, research flow, and we can keep on discussing amongst us, because I think there are people.
Maybe my question can give you food for thought for the next seminar.
Okay.
I hope you can give one more informal talk just amongst this small circle. I have a fundamental question on the word philosophy in the Western context.
Yeah.
I attended a lecture in Norway some 20 years ago. There was an expert from JNU University who gave us an introduction on the history or